Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. We are coming to you live today on Friday afternoon, and we have some reactions from the first game of the 2024 NFL season. Last night, we got what could be described as an opening game classic between the Kansas City Chiefs and Baltimore Ravens. Was a rematch of last year's AFC Championship game, and once again, the game lived up to expectations. So we will dive into takeaways from both the perspectives of the Chiefs and the Ravens. Additionally, we have some insight for fantasy football managers as well, talking about which players could see a bigger role develop for them moving forward, which players have maybe some red flags going forward for them moving forward here after a little bit of some lackluster performances as well on that front from some prominent names. So we'll be breaking down all angles on last night's game, and then additionally we're going to be looking ahead to this upcoming weekend, and I'm going to be handing out my top 5 picks of the weekend, betting against some spreads. So this is going to be a new segment that we do every Friday where ideally I am going to keep track of each of my picks throughout the course of the year, and we'll see how we do with it ultimately. And then finally, we are going to end off the show by reacting to the breaking news that the Miami Dolphins are signing cornerback Jalen Ramsey to a new contract extension that surpasses Pat Surtain's record-breaking contract that he signed earlier this week. So we'll talk about the details surrounding that deal, whether or not it was a good move for the Dolphins and what impact it could have for them this upcoming season. But before we get into that, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To any of our viewers, be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on the latest happenings in sports, whether it's a take of your own or a question that is burning inside. We want to hear what you have to say. We here at the GSMC Podcast Network thrive off of interaction with our fans, so don't hesitate to use that comment section to give us your thoughts. And additionally, if you would like to become a bigger part of the show, you can use the super chat feature that is now available on YouTube by just clicking the $sign at the bottom of the screen. You can leave a comment along with a tip or donation to get your comment to be recognized on screen and have it pop up for everyone to see. Additionally, you can do so by going to the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker for our video viewers. That is gsmcpodcast.net. Anything would be very greatly appreciated on either one of those fronts. We're going to start off the show by, of course, talking about last night's game between the Chiefs and the Ravens. And this ultimately turned into a classic to kick off the 2024 season. Last year as well, these past couple seasons with the Chiefs, we've been, very lucky as to getting some awesome games to kick off the year. And it definitely lived up to expectations. A rematch of last season's AFC Championship game. And once again, it was the Chiefs coming out on top, but just barely. It took Isaiah Likely wearing a shoe size, one size too big, for the Chiefs to come away with this win. So ultimately, it was a very close game, went down to the final seconds, and we're going to break it down from both perspectives. But I want to start on the side of the Chiefs here, and my biggest takeaway really for them in this game was the fact that their offense looks like it can start to return to form to at least some degree, considering the fact that even last year was ugly. I think we can all acknowledge from at least an aesthetic standpoint of talking about their offense. It was very stagnant at times. The Chiefs led the NFL in drops as a team, and there were a lot of red flags. It was the first time in the Patrick Mahomes era in Kansas City that the Chiefs finished outside of the top 6 in points per game. The Chiefs' offense last year was 15th. So again, considering you have Patrick Mahomes offensively, the regular season last year was a bit of a mess. Now, obviously, we saw they were able to overcome that, and ultimately the offense was there enough for their playoff run. But that being said, they were very reliant as well on their defense. They were some grinded out, low scoring games, even in the playoffs as well to some degree. Only 19 points scored in regulation against the 49ers in overtime or in regulation before overtime. I believe it was 17 points scored against the Ravens in the AFC Championship game. So the Chiefs definitely have hopes that their offense can sort of take a step forward once again, and I thought that they showed a lot of promise in that category with their performance last night. Rashee Rice looks like he could legitimately emerge as a number one wide receiver for this Chiefs team. He was excellent. 7 receptions, 103 yards, and he's somebody who started to emerge down the stretch of last season, averaged 86 receiving yards per game from week 11 through the end of the regular season, which is great. But now it seems like he could even take on a bigger role. And this is something we're going to get into Travis Kelce in particular a little bit later. But he had a quieter game. And part of it was because I thought that Rice really emerged in that intermediate passing game where Travis Kelce has been so prominent these past couple years, that Rice was actually the one with his route running, just getting open across the middle of the field. And Patrick Mahomes hitting him about 5-10 yards downfield, and then him making some additional moves with the ball in his hand to ultimately total 103 yards in this game. And I think that is a really great sign for them. Obviously, it's great when you have Travis Kelce. That gives you the flexibility to move off potentially the best wide receiver in the NFL in Tyreek Hill. But Travis is obviously getting older, and there's only so long that you can hold on to those aging tight ends, essentially as your number one receiving threat. In steps Rashee Rice, and it seems like he could maybe be somebody who takes on a bigger role this upcoming season. I feel like a lot of people were sort of unsure with him, myself included to some degree, just a matter of what the overall split of the work share is going to be between all of the pass catchers in Kansas City, and Rice looked phenomenal for them, at least to start off the season. Then to that, you add Xavier Worthy, the first-round rookie that is garnering a lot of love this morning, considering the fact that it's clear that he is a special athletic talent with some upside as well and a ton of room to grow as more than just an athlete, but somebody like Tyreek Hill, where yes, obviously what catches the eye immediately is the blazing speed, but I mean, for whatever it's worth, he ends up scoring on his first touch of the game. Andy Reid absolutely had that play that Worthy ended up scoring on. It was a reverse jet sweep to Worthy. That's something that that he had drawn up from the moment that he knew they were going to take Rashee Rice or take Xavier Worthy, and ultimately, that was a heads-up play, and the way that he weaved through traffic Worthy on that play, very impressive to me. He only had 3 touches in this game, but he made the most of every single opportunity. All 3 of them were at least 12 yards, and 2 of them were for touchdowns. So he also had the touchdown in the second half where it was a blown coverage from the Ravens defense, and ultimately he was just wide open, streaking to the end zone, and naturally Patrick Mahomes is going to find a wide open receiver like that. So I'm definitely very high on it. I still think that, I wouldn't bank on him being a 2 touchdown a game guy. I think that he's going to have moments where he's a little bit more hit or miss, but again, the ceiling with Worthy is so high, and somebody that could be extremely dangerous to have paired alongside Patrick Mahomes in the long term. But like I mentioned, the 2 young wide receivers are really what got the job done for the Chiefs passing game in this one. Travis Kelce Didn't get a huge game from him, just 4 targets as a whole, 3 catches, 34 yards. But this is also, I think, to be expected. We talked about this yesterday on the show, that I do believe that Travis Kelce is not necessarily going to save himself for the playoffs. He's going to play in every single one of these games, and he's going to give it 100% every time that he's on the field. But I'm not anticipating him to, reach those extreme levels of high targets that he had for so many years. That, especially now with these other pieces, Mahomes is going to try and work these other players into the rotation as well, that their offense really could have, I would say at this moment, 3 really promising pass catchers, and then add to that the fact that Hollywood Brown was injured for this game, and when he comes back, will be interesting to see what he's able to provide for them. This is a very promising offense from a pass catching standpoint, and ultimately from the offense as a whole. Now, it's not a perfect offense. The running game was a little bit lackluster for me. Isaiah Pacheco, just 45 yards on 15 carries. You would prefer to see more there. They don't really have a backup running back behind him either. It was Justin Steele. It's Steele. I just gotta make sure I have his first name right. Carson Steele, excuse me. The undrafted free agent rookie that is essentially their running back too, at least on the ground. They did use Samaje Perine at least somewhat in the passing game, but overall just not a ton from the running game. Ultimately, outside of that Xavier Worthy touchdown run, the longest pickup from any on the ground from any runner for Kansas City was just 5 yards. So, you're talking about the running game. It's not like it's supposed to be this extremely explosive part of the game. And Isaiah Pacheco, with how hard he runs, we know that he's capable of it, at least to some degree. But, that was a good Ravens defensive front that they were facing, so I'm not overreacting. Again, maybe if I'm being nitpicky here, I would have preferred to see maybe a little bit more explosiveness from the run game, but it's also week 1, and I'm sure that across the league, these things will take time. We're going to get into that with the Ravens part of this equation as well. But before we do that, I want to just sort of finish off the Chiefs' thoughts here by talking about their defense as well. Did you notice that the Chiefs were without their number 1 cornerback from last year? Because I didn't really. And to be fair, it's not like the Ravens have an elite wide receiver 1. Zay Flowers is somebody that, you saw especially the way they were feeding him last night, that they hope that he can emerge into that. But he's not at that point yet, which is totally fair. It was the first game of his second season, that he's got time to grow. But ultimately, it's not like they have that big physical wide receiver on the perimeter that can make you pay if you're not strong enough at the cornerback position. But even with that being said, they have Trent McDuffie, who is now stepping into a new role. I thought that early on maybe he was working through some adjustments. He was a nickelback for the first couple years of his career, was all pro as a nickelback last year. Now he's playing more on the outside as their cornerback 1. So overall, it was a pretty good game for him, but he's going to have some room to grow in a new position. But, outside of that, I thought that the remainder of the secondary did a pretty good job in pass coverage. And it's not like they were tested super heavily necessarily, but I thought they held their own. Definitely some growing pains in terms of, just tackling and such, where I thought that Brian Cook and Shamari Connor, both of them, a little bit new faces, at least in terms of taking on a bigger role with the Chiefs defense this upcoming year. Thought that they had their moments where they had some rough tackling. Brian Cook was the one that got juked out by the goal line on that Isaiah Likely touchdown, but ultimately, again, hard to complain all too much about what the Chiefs put on film. Now, ultimately, Ravens did have over 450 yards, so I'm not, losing my mind about how good the Chiefs defense looked. But again, I thought they did a good job against the pass. I thought that the front 7 was excellent in this game, outside of containing Lamar Jackson in the run game, which is obviously, where a very large portion of those yards came from. Lamar Jackson, 122 yards on the ground. But Saw Chris Jones, of course, continuing to wreak havoc for other teams. He racked up a couple counting stats for himself, a sack and a tackle for a loss, but really his impact went beyond just the stat sheet, opened up opportunities for some of his other teammates. I thought that Tershawn Wharton turned in a pretty good performance, definitely took advantage of the fact that Chris Jones was demanding all of this extra attention from the Baltimore offensive line. That Wharton, he had a couple opportunities specifically matched up against Andrew Voorhees, the Ravens left guard, where he was able to put some pressures on Lamar Jackson, ultimately didn't get home, but somebody that definitely stood out on film to me that I think is a positive sign for this Chiefs defense. And anytime you're playing Lamar Jackson in the run game, it is going to be difficult to contain him. And, with all that said, I think that there's a lot that the Chiefs can feel good about. Was it a perfect performance from them? Absolutely not. But, this game also could have been different. Now, you can say that Isaiah Likely could have been tackled or such on that long touchdown. I also think that Juju Smith-Schuster could have caught that ball at the goal line. That would have allowed the Chiefs to score another touchdown at that point, so maybe they would have had more breathing room there. Not going to get into the whole hypothetical conversation. I thought the Chiefs let the Ravens sort of hang in the game for longer than they probably should have, but ultimately, a win's a win. And I do think that this Chiefs team as a whole looked legitimately improved from last season. The three-peat is definitely on the table, and ultimately, football is so back. Last night was an excellent game, and you just have to feel good about the season ahead. I'm really looking forward to it, but that being said, disappointment is obviously something that comes with that as well. And last night was a disappointing loss for the Ravens, who had a number of opportunities to capitalize and were unable to do so. So I want to dive into what my takeaways were for the Ravens in this game. But before we do so, we have to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that sound. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. As we just talked about Thursday night's game between the Chiefs and the Ravens from the Kansas City perspective. Now I want to look on the other side for the Ravens. And again, any loss is disappointing, but ultimately this was a close game. They showed that they can compete with the best team in the NFL. And I mean, again, if Isaiah Likely's foot is just a centimeter back, that's a touchdown. And the Ravens were looking to go for it for two, it seemed like, at least, with John Harbaugh pretty emphatically holding up the two fingers after it seemed like that touchdown was going to stand at first. So I don't think we were ever getting to overtime in this game. And I don't want to get too far into this because we're talking hypotheticals, but I think if the Ravens do score there on that Likely play at the back of the end zone and they go for two, I think that they were going to be able to convert. Just that team at the goal line is going to be very scary, in my opinion, with Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry. But on the note of Derrick Henry, I want to get into this idea that I thought that the Ravens were going to come out in this game in particular, considering how the AFC Championship game went down, and that they were going to reestablish the running game headed into this season. Now, that didn't really end up being the case. Lamar Jackson, 41 pass attempts in this game, also had a number of different scrambles out of dropbacks as well that sort of skew the numbers a little bit more towards the running game, but they went pretty pass heavy in this game once again. And because of the fact that Lamar was scrambling and some of the designed quarterback plays, there was absolutely a running game. Lamar Jackson, 122 rushing yards in this game, but outside of that, wasn't really an elite running game overall. Derrick Henry was not as big of a factor as I was anticipating. Lamar Jackson had more rushing attempts than the rest of the Ravens combined in this game. Henry in this game, 13 carries, 46 yards, did score the first touchdown of the game, and that's where I just mentioned I think that the Ravens offense can be scary in the red zone. That's where I do feel like Derrick Henry is going to have a definitive role for himself, but overall, this could be a little bit more of a limited year from Derrick Henry than I was anticipating. It was pretty clear that his role is going to be reduced in comparison to what we saw for so many years in Tennessee, where he was the, bell cow workhorse running back for them. In this game, any real passing situation, they were deciding to put in Justice Hill instead. And it ultimately worked for them in the passing game. I think that Lamar definitely does like his checkdowns as well. And Justice Hill, he had a number of receptions in that AFC Championship game. And this game for Justice Hill, 8 targets as well. And I think that that's sort of a different conversation that I'm going to wait to get into, but Lamar's sort of hesitancy to push it downfield quite as much. But Justice Hill, is just definitively a better receiving running back than Derrick Henry. That being said, we saw him get touches in the red zone and ultimately resulted in a touchdown. So I do think that he is going to have a productive season, especially in terms of rushing touchdowns. But again, this is somebody who just last year led the NFL in carries. I don't anticipate that being the case once again. I'm sure there are some bumps that the Ravens would like to have Derrick Henry be a more prominent of their every down offense. But, baby steps, I suppose. This was Henry's first official game with the Ravens, so these things do tend to take a little bit of time. But I did think that there were definitely glimpses of Baltimore being able to have this two-headed monster in the backfield towards the end of that first drive, especially Henry started getting himself going then, and then he ends up scoring a touchdown, obviously, on that first drive. Henry had back-to-back solid runs to set up a 3rd and short. They fake it to him, and Lamar Jackson at one point pulls it to the outside for an 11-yard gain coming off of those successful runs with Derrick Henry. And then the first play of the next drive, it was a play-action pass, fakes the handoff to Derrick Henry, and ends up being a 15-yard dump-off to Isaiah Likely, who obviously had a huge game, and we'll get into his performance specifically. But again, as for Derrick Henry, I'm not out on him entirely. I think that there are a number of different ways that this Ravens team is going to have to improve. One of them being Derrick Henry, being a more prominent part of their offense. Additionally, though, he can't do it by himself. There were some tough moments for the Ravens offensive line in this game, considering the fact that I thought, especially throughout the first 3 quarters, they were struggling a little bit. Now, this is to be expected, at least to some degree, losing 3 starters from what was a very good offensive line last season, that the overall cohesion isn't what it was last year. I'm not really sure what was going on at right tackle for them in this game. Last year, losing their right tackle from last year, ultimately, Patrick McCary won out the starting job in training camp, it at least seemed like. But Roger Rosengarten, their second-round rookie that they drafted out of Washington, did get a good amount of run time as well. Early on in the game, after he came in on the third drive, he did have a very unfortunate welcome to the NFL moment where it was Chris Jones working on him, shucking him to the side, and ultimately wrapping up Lamar for what ended up being the strip sack. But even worse than that for Rosengarten was the fact that it was Chris Jones wrapping up Lamar, and then Rosengarten was sort of trying to chase down a defender as well, and he sort of ran through the arm of Lamar Jackson. So Rosengarten with a little bit of a forced fumble there. But ultimately, everybody has their welcome to the NFL moment. Rosengarten got hit with it immediately, but him and McCary did sort of split reps in this game. I'm not sure if it was injury related to McCary. I thought that they switched back and forth a couple times. I could be mistaken there, but something to keep an eye on moving forward here. And just in general as well, this offensive line I think is something that eventually could shape into form. You saw the fourth quarter. I thought that they were actually the ones that were maybe slightly better conditioned than the Chiefs defense, considering the fact that they were moving the ball pretty well in that fourth quarter and on the ground game. So I'm not ruling them out just yet. And that's also a very tough Chiefs front seven as well. So it's not like they had any cakewalk headed into the season either. I'm not panicking about it, but that being said, we're going to need to see them be better. But all of this to be said, I think it sort of brings us to this conversation with Lamar Jackson, where the offensive line had moments opening up the dropbacks and giving Lamar Jackson a clean pocket. Not super consistently, though, so they'll need to improve there. Lamar Jackson as well had a great game based off of the running game. Like we mentioned, 16 carries, 122 yards, and really he was the sole reason that they were, sticking around in this game, was because of the fact that with the running prowess, he was so impressive. That being said, I was pretty underwhelmed with the passing as a whole, and it's fine. Yeah, I could be maybe nitpicking a little bit here, but I don't think that Lamar Jackson looked very good at all in terms of attacking downfield. Thought it was a lot of dump-offs, even Isaiah Likely. Now, the touchdown pass to him was a very nice play from Lamar Jackson, scrambling around with defenders in his area, rolling out to his right on the run. Very impressive. Outside of that, though, I thought that Lamar was off on a lot of his deeper shots, and it gets magnified as well, the fact that he misses a couple throws on that final drive, one to Isaiah Likely, one to Zay Flowers, that could have changed the outcome of this game. At least would have definitely, to some degree, changed the output of this game, but ultimately, I didn't think he looked very impressive in the passing game, and that's the thing. I have confidence in Lamar Jackson's passing ability. I thought that he displayed it last year, and I am a believer. And I'm sort of just rooting. Maybe I'm investing myself too much into it, but I'm rooting for Lamar to prove all of these doubters wrong about the idea that he isn't a passing quarterback, because I think he has that in his game. But last night wasn't a very good display of that, in my opinion. And the counting stats look pretty solid overall for Lamar. 26 of 41, 273 yards and a touchdown. But again, a lot of it was passes around the line of scrimmage, relying a lot on receivers running after the catch. Again, I'm trying to say this in not a negative way for Lamar Jackson, but just I think he would also admit that in the passing game, he could have been better. And that's something that I anticipate will get better moving forward. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section on that. Some quick notes defensively for the Ravens. I thought they looked pretty good. Now, they allowed 350 yards, so it's not like they were shut down by any means. The blown coverage by Marlon Humphrey was pretty rough. The one that opened up the wide open touchdown for Xavier Worthy in the second half. That was a brutal moment for them, but ultimately, playing the Chiefs with all of these playmakers, you take away that one play and it's not necessarily a fair way to go about things, but I do feel like overall you can feel pretty good about how this Ravens team looked. The front seven looked strong as ever. A little bit of worries, I suppose, with their linebackers getting caught in coverage a number of times, and it's tough when you're playing Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes, the way that they are going to draw up plays to get your linebackers on their speedsters, and obviously Mahomes is going to find them. So, guys like Marcus Williams had some not great Roquan Smith as well, to some degree, in coverage. Didn't look great. That's to be expected a little bit. But overall, I thought the D-line played really well. And you had some key young players standing out especially. Odafe Owe has been a very good player for the past couple years. And, he continues to be headed on the right trajectory for them. But then you got other contributions as well that I thought were really impactful. Travis Jones, the defensive tackle, he had a pretty nice game. You look at David Ojabo, who, finally is healthy, former second-round pick in 2022, and he ends up with a sack. So all things considered, I thought that their front seven played pretty well. Also got some really nice contributions from Trenton Simpson. 5 tackles in this game, recorded half a sack, and had a really nice pass deflection. I just mentioned linebackers struggling in coverage a little bit. That wasn't the case for Simpson. He had a nice pass breakup against Rashee Rice. He also had a really nice tackle out on the perimeter. He's an athlete. He can move around the field. He can be versatile for this Ravens defense. So you look at Patrick Queen, headed out the door in free agency this offseason. Trenton Simpson could take on a bigger role this upcoming year and be a real contributor for this Ravens team and help avoid any sort of a significant drop-off from what was the number one scoring defense. No, I always forget, number 1 or number 2 scoring defense in the NFL last season. The Chiefs and the Ravens were 1 and 2. And so the fact that past 2 times we've seen both of these teams they've been playing, or past 2 times I've seen the Ravens, they have played the Chiefs, which gets me jumbled up a little bit. But that being said, let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section about what your takeaways were for the Ravens. Is there any sort of panic for them? I would argue no. I do think that they have a difficult schedule, though, and this felt like, not a must-win by any means, because next week they have the Raiders, but then you're looking at Dallas versus Buffalo, at Cincinnati, so, they're going to have some real tests in front of them for the early portion of this season, but ultimately, I think they'll be okay. But we are also going to now be looking into some of the fantasy football specific implications from last night. Should fantasy owners be concerned about the lack of usage for Derrick Henry overall on the night? Where are we at with the Isaiah Likely versus Mark Andrews split of target shares and more? So we're going to dive into all of that. But first, a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as I now want to sort of look at last night's game between the Chiefs and the Ravens from a fantasy football perspective and talk about what is to be expected from a lot of the key skill position players that we saw last night. But we're going to start very quickly here at the quarterback position. Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, both of them are pretty much must starts for just about every game they could possibly play in. I do think it's of course notable that Lamar Jackson, there were definitely some concerns about what is the rushing outlook going to look like for him now that he is splitting attempts with Derrick Henry in that same backfield. Clearly, there shouldn't be all that much of a worry. Now, that being said, I thought that the red zone possession on the first drive was sort of a prime example of the fact that when it gets down to that, especially early on in the year, I do believe the Ravens are going to try and lean on Derrick Henry a little bit more. We saw Lamar last night with 16 rush attempts. That's great. He was very effective, 122 yards, but he's also your quarterback, and it can get a little bit risky if you lean on that too heavily. So ultimately, I think they're going to try and at least somewhat reduce the overall workload for Lamar, but he's still going to have his opportunities. He's Lamar Jackson. His legs are the ultimate weapon. Last night, if you watched the game, you probably saw that he became the third all-time leading rusher as a quarterback. So, that's never not going to be a part of his game. That shouldn't have to worry about Lamar, but at least worth noting that I do think red zone touches are going to be a little bit more in favor of Derrick Henry, especially considering the fact that they aren't necessarily using him on passing downs anyways. So you just went out, you made this splash move that a lot of people are excited about. They're going to want to show off their new toy a little bit in Derrick Henry. But additionally, on the other side here, Patrick Mahomes wasn't a great performance from him overall. The stats for him were slightly underwhelming. I believe in standard scoring leagues, he was somewhere from 15 to 16 points that he ultimately scored. The interception was pretty bad for him. Not totally sure what went on there. He was getting hit as he threw a little bit, but that was still way off, way short. Was a pretty impressive play from Roquan Smith to be able to go down, turn his body, and stay under that thing. So, give Roquan his credit there. But that being said, Mahomes overall in this game, 20 of 28, 291 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. It's not like he was incredible in this game, but I also think that what we talked about in the first segment as well, there's a number of new weapons in Kansas City, and I think that their offense is going to be much more functional this upcoming season than what we saw last year, where they led the NFL in drops. I don't think that's going to be the case. It's only going to get better, or easier, I should say, for Mahomes once Hollywood Brown comes back from injury as well, currently nursing a shoulder injury. Don't have an exact timeline yet on that, but I think that Patrick Mahomes is going to be just fine. But outside of that, again, we talked about Derrick Henry already, and he's not going to be a carry-heavy guy. He's definitely going to split the overall snaps with Justice Hill, maybe a little bit more than at least I initially anticipated on those passing downs. But I think that he's going to make his money's worth in the red zone to make it worth it. That there's a good chance, and as an owner of Derrick Henry myself in one of my fantasy leagues, I took him in the second round. Feels like that could have been possibly a little bit of a reach. It was late second round. But that being said, I think he can be a consistent 10-point per game running back. But that also being said, he could be touchdown reliant for his overall fantasy output. So we will definitely be keeping an eye on Derrick Henry. But really the bigger question, I would say, on the Baltimore side of the ball is, what do we do with these tight ends? Just yesterday, I talked about how I am skeptical about the idea of really rolling with either one of Baltimore's tight ends in Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely, because at this point, Likely is sort of the up-and-coming option for them, but the Ravens are also in win-now mode, so it's not like trying to develop Likely is at the top of their priority list at this moment in particular. And also additionally with that, Likely and Andrews both have 2 years left on their contract. So I'm sure the Ravens are going to try and take advantage of both of them moving forward. So this ends up being a huge game for Likely. 9 receptions, 111 yards, and a touchdown. Obviously, we know he could have had another touchdown in there as well, but I mean, a great debut to his 2024 campaign. We saw Likely really step up while Mark Andrews was dealing with his injury last year. That it does feel like this could be a slight changing of the guard moment. Mark Andrews did not look his best by any means last night. I'm not fully just abandoning him now and saying that he's no good anymore. He's still 28 years old. It's not like Mark Andrews is an old man. Now, he's overcoming a couple significant injuries, not just the one that he suffered last year against the Bengals, I believe it was, but also the fact that he was in a car crash just a couple months ago during the offseason as well. So we could see a slow start to the season from him. I was already, like I mentioned, skeptical about starting either tight end moving forward for the most part, but it does definitely feel like we could be headed towards a little bit more of an Isaiah Likely-centric passing game. And the other part to this whole conversation as well is the fact that it's not like the Ravens are extremely deep in terms of pass catchers. Zay Flowers is somebody that they absolutely made it an effort to prioritize him and get him his touches. He had a couple carries along the way, along with an additional 10 targets in the passing game itself. So he will definitely be expected to be prominent for the Ravens this upcoming season. A great sign for fantasy football owners. We mentioned this yesterday on the show. I sort of wish I went on some sort of prop bet for Zay Flowers, but considering the fact that last year the low point of his season was in that AFC Championship game when he fumbled out of the end zone, that it should have been a little bit of a given that Todd Monken was going to try and force feed Flowers a little bit to build up his confidence for the upcoming season. And, you know, I just mentioned that for the sake that I think there was probably even an extra emphasis on Zay Flowers in this game. And, 12 touches, or ultimately ended up being 8 because there were 4 targets that weren't caught. But, 12 intended targets for him, 12 intended touches, I should say, is maybe a little bit high for him to expect that every single week. But that being said, he's the clear number 1 wide receiver there. You should feel good about his fantasy value, and how that relates to Isaiah Likely and Mark Andrews is but with the fact that it's not like there are other wide receivers really getting in the mix that are further taking away from Andrews and Likely. Outside of Zay Flowers, it was Justice Hill that was, the other non-tight end receiving threat for them, where, Rashad Bateman, 2 catches, 53 yards, had excellent play that I feel like is going to be a little bit overlooked because of what preceded, but I thought that was a great job from Bateman to high point the ball down the right sideline on that final drive for Baltimore. So wanted to give him some credit there. Obviously, Bateman's somebody that, as NFL fans, we've maybe been waiting on for a good while, and we really haven't seen that. But if he could emerge, I mean, he's still a young player overall, Bateman is. So I'm not entirely ruling it out, the idea either, that somebody who is still 24 years old has a couple different levels to continue to evolve with. But I do feel like, ultimately more of those targets are going to be going to the tight ends than Bateman getting a significantly increased role. But I did just mention Justice Hill. We talked about Derrick Henry earlier. I would also keep an eye out on Justice Hill. Ultimately, depends on if you're in a PPR league or not. But if you are in points per reception, I mean, Justice Hill could emerge into a sneaky weapon to sort of at least have on the bench if anything were to happen to Derrick Henry as well. Not a bad handicap if you have him in a league, somebody to maybe keep an eye on. But I want to look at the Chiefs side of this as well, and the fact that I don't want to overreact to just one game, but Rashee Rice seems like he might actually emerge to be one of the best fantasy wide receivers in the NFL this season. And I know that does sound like a little bit of an overreaction, but when you're playing with Patrick Mahomes, you have to understand there are going to be chances to be had. The issue was last season, nobody took advantage of it really. Outside of Travis Kelce, of course, but so many issues in that overall situation with the Chiefs receiving core that now Rice seems like somebody Mahomes definitely trusts. I mean, if that weren't at least obvious from the heavy number of targets that he got from Mahomes in this game, ultimately 9 targets, 7 receptions, 103 yards. I do think that that's something that we could seriously see Rice do at least somewhat semi-consistently. We talked about this in the first segment. He was 86, I believe it was, yards per game from week 11 and on last season. So I think that I'm definitely high on that. Xavier Worthy could absolutely end up being a star for the Chiefs. I have reservations about him being a must start in fantasy football every single week. 3 touches. Now, obviously, he ends up having a huge scoring output because he scores touchdowns on 2 of them, and he's probably going to find the end zone a good amount this season. But that being said, I think it's going to be pretty reliant on explosive plays. If Marlon Humphrey plays him better on that receiving touchdown, you're looking at, half of the production, essentially, because all of his points, for the most part, came off of touchdowns that I do feel like I'm not really ready to fully commit to him as a full-time fantasy football starter, but somebody that, as a flex option, as a spot start, could definitely give you a ton of upside for fantasy football. And then the last name that we just got to get to really quickly is Travis Kelce here, where last night was quiet for him. I talked about this yesterday. I think that the Chiefs are probably during the regular season going to try and involve more of their other weapons to at least give Kelce maybe a little bit more rest as he's, getting up there in age and is coming off of multiple deep playoff runs where he was doing everything for the Chiefs. I think that Kelce, if you have him, you have to start him. You really don't have a choice, but I just don't think that he's going to be in that upper echelon of fantasy football tight ends. By the time we come to the playoffs, I expect him to still be a very effective player, period. But that being said, fantasy football-wise, I do hesitate a little bit with certain parts of it. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section on Travis Kelce and his production, or just in general with what you thought of last night and the fantasy football implications. But we're now going to be looking ahead at the rest of the week 1 slate, and I'm going to be handing out my top 5 best bets of betting against the spread for these NFL games. So we're going to be diving into that, but first we'll take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're now going to be doing the first edition of what hopefully goes well of a new segment that we're going to be doing every week, and that is I'm going to be handing out my top 5 betting plays of betting with or against the spread for NFL matchups. We'll start a tally system as well. If things are going really poorly, I'll make sure that I step out of the gambling sphere here, but I do have some thoughts. Yesterday I did say Chiefs -3, so, not that that's officially on the record and is going on the overall tally, but not a bad start at least. But again, 5 plays every single week, and the first one that we're going to be diving into here is the Arizona Cardinals at the Buffalo Bills. I think I've talked about this the other day. The Cardinals are a team that I think could make a sneaky playoff run this upcoming season. I have them winning about 10 games this year. I think they're going to be one of these surprise teams that come out from, I guess, a little bit the gutter. The reality is the Cardinals were a competitive team even when it was Joshua Dobbs starting at quarterback. It's just that the personnel last year was so subpar that ultimately they fell short in all of these games, or most of these games, I should say, but I think that you're looking at a lot of upside as long as Kyler Murray can stay healthy. I'm a very big fan of their head coach, Jonathan Gannon. I think that he is one of the brighter defensive minds in the NFL. He just got a bunch of sort of veteran defensive starters. And on the other side with the Bills, while I do think that they're also going to be a playoff team once again, you're looking at a lot of losses on defense, and not just in free agency. You have a bunch of those key secondary members leaving or they ultimately released them and then left once they hit the open market. But not just that, Matt Milano is dealing with a torn bicep that is expected to keep him out until around December. So the Bills are without a lot of their key defensive players and offense as well, without Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis. Now, the Bills, they end up drafting Keon Coleman, who I really liked out of Florida State, and I think that he could provide some upside for them. Especially, I'd love to see him sort of work himself into having a more definitive red zone threat role, because I don't think that Allen's really had that throughout his tenure in Buffalo yet. From a wide receiver standpoint, obviously Diggs was a top 10 wide receiver for his tenure in Buffalo, but again, in terms of having a more physical build, Keon Coleman is that. Khalil Shakir also has a lot of upside for them as well. Started coming along in the second half of last season. But all that to be said, I think it takes time to sort of build that cohesion, to have that relationship and chemistry between Josh Allen and some of these younger wide receivers that they're now throwing to. You also look the tight end room. Dalton Kincaid expected to have a good year. This is just his second or third season. Dawson Knox as well, not a usual heavy usage tight end in years past. That I think 6.5 points is far too much for the Cardinals. They're going to keep this competitive in Buffalo, so there is that going for them, but ultimately I feel pretty good about the Cardinals covering a spread of just about a touchdown. Another 1 o'clock game, the Tennessee Titans versus the Chicago Bears. Don't love the spread here being 3.5 points, but that being said, I think the Bears are just significantly better than the Titans. Now, all of the things I just said about the cohesion of Josh Allen with his wide receivers, the same can be said to some degree with Caleb Williams and his receiving core, where you have a lot more veteran experience in DJ Moore and you have Keenan Allen, that it will take some time for that chemistry to develop. But that being said, I just feel like the Bears have built up a lot of momentum over the course of the past handful of months. Hard Knocks as well, maybe playing a slight factor into that, but I think the Bears are really good. And, even if it does take a little bit of time for their offense to really pull it together, I think their defense has a chance to be a surprise great group this upcoming season. And as much as I'm intrigued by the upside of Will Levis, I think that he's put out pretty good tape since he made his first start last season. Ultimately, I think that Bears minus 3.5 is the play here. Don't love that half point to be specific, but I think the Bears can comfortably win by a touchdown in this game. Next pick here, the Houston Texans versus the Indianapolis Colts. I believe this line has moved throughout the course of the game. I think that the Texans were initially favored by 3.5 points when I was skimming earlier in the week. The line's now at 3, which makes this game definitely harder to pick, but I think that the Colts have a great chance at home. Anthony Richardson, much anticipated, and I've talked about that I do have some slight reservations with Anthony Richardson in terms of him consistently getting it done through the air. And I think that ultimately he has all the tools and he will eventually be able to. But this idea that he could be a dark horse MVP candidate, I'm pumping the brakes on that a little bit. That being said, Richardson was excellent when he did play against the Texans last year. They have this game at home, and I think that the Colts can keep this one close. Again, 3 points is a little bit of a nerve-wracking line. The Texans are a very good team, and I definitely think that they're better than the Colts, but I feel like it's a younger team that I think almost with the Texans needs a little bit of a wake-up call just to sort of lock themselves back in moving forward. I don't feel excellent about this one, but I am going with the Colts plus 3. Then a couple later games here for the last game here. We have the Monday Night Football game between the New York Jets and the San Francisco 49ers. And in this game, I am leaning with the Niners minus 4.5. Now, I'm not super high on the Jets. I know other people are. I've had people in the comment section tell me that I am too low on the Jets. There's definitely probably some truth to that. I am, at the end of the day, a Patriots fan that has seen some incompetence for the Jets for a long time, that I'm not all the way there. It's not even about that. I think the Jets ultimately have a winning record this season, but the 49ers, I don't see the threat of a Super Bowl hangover the same way that other people do, really. I think that ultimately, this is still possibly the best roster in the NFL. Now, one thing that could potentially worry is the fact that they've had so much drama in the offseason that maybe they're not fully ready for this Week 1 matchup. It's not like the Jets have exactly had a clean slate either for themselves, that they've had their fair share of drama along the way. And this is another situation as well where you're talking about the 49ers facing their former defensive coordinator in Robert Saleh as a head coach. I think that Shanahan he's a significantly better coach, at least what we've seen, in limited tenure from Robert Saleh, that I think that the 49ers are going to be able to win semi-comfortably here at home. A lot of pressure on the Jets this upcoming season, playing on Monday Night Football. Basically, 1 year after Aaron Rodgers tore his tore his Achilles on Monday Night Football last year. But I think that I think this is the 49ers game. That being said, 4.5 points for two good defenses facing one another could be a little bit scary along the way as well. That it's a little bit of a bigger spread than I would have preferred, and this does feel like a little bit of a sucker's bet, but I am going to go with the 49ers in this one. We're missing the last graphic as well, but the final game and final pick that I have additionally is the Dallas Cowboys going to Cleveland for their Week 1 matchup. In Cleveland, I have the Browns winning minus 2.5. This is a game where I think that the Browns are easily going to be able to win the line of scrimmage, at least offense versus defense. And I think additionally, the Browns the Browns defense versus the Cowboys offense is the way that I should put it. And I don't think anything's going to be easy for this Cowboys offense in Week 1. And then I additionally think as well that you're going to see a little bit of a new system in Dallas defensively. Dan Quinn out as the defensive coordinator. In comes Mike Zimmer, who I do think can be an upgrade over what Dan Quinn was last year. But you're also looking at Deron Bland dealing with an injury early on. That linebacking core for Dallas is still a little bit questionable. So 2.5 points for the Browns. I'm taking it, but let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section on any of these 5 games that we looked at or anything else that sort of catches your eye. I think that there are some very interesting lines out there, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on them as well. But we are now going to take our final break of the show, and when we come back on the other side, I want to dive into the breaking news that the Miami Dolphins have signed cornerback Jalen Ramsey to a record-breaking contract. So we will be touching on that, but first a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where we're now going to be diving into the news that broke just this morning that the Miami Dolphins are signing cornerback Jalen Ramsey to a record-breaking contract extension. Just earlier this week, we saw the Broncos and cornerback Pat Surtain agree to what was the highest-paid defensive back contract in NFL history in terms of average annual value. And in comes the Dolphins to swoop in and just barely up that. It is a 3-year, $72.3 million extension for Jalen Ramsey, who has been an All-Pro for years now. And even last year, dealt with injuries through the first 7 games, but when he came back, definitely made his impact felt for Miami as they went on to make the playoffs. And when I mentioned that Surtain contract, he got 4 years, $96 million, which was $24 million per year in terms of average annual value. And in comes the Dolphins to give Ramsey $24.1 million per year. So a little bit petty almost, but honestly, this is a well-deserved contract when you're talking about the legacy of Jalen Ramsey, where he definitely deserves to be one of the highest paid cornerbacks and defensive backs in NFL history. That being said, it does feel like this could be a little bit of an overpay for Ramsey. Now, he's still just 29 years old, and just 29 years old, obviously about to turn 30, so it's not like he's young by any means, but it's not like he's old yet either. That I still think he has a few good seasons ahead of him as well. That it's not like this is going to be a contract that I feel awful about, but that being said, I think it's maybe a little bit of an overpay in terms of, a couple of years from now, we'll see how it ages. Again, definitely still possible that he is at the top of his game. We've seen some steps back over the past couple seasons. He produced well enough for them last year that I don't think they're crazy for doing this, but that being said, could be something that we look back on and does not age all that well, especially considering the fact that Ramsey may not even start the season for the Dolphins once again this year. Mike McDaniel was speaking to the media earlier today and said that Ramsey's status for Sunday's game against the Jaguars is still a bit of an unknown. He's dealing with a hamstring injury, so it doesn't sound like it's too serious that he'd be able to return soon enough anyways, but not exactly great news to hear right after you give somebody the most expensive contract in terms of average value per year, and immediately you find out he might not play your next game. But maybe that's just a little bit of an overreaction. It's not like these contracts are about, trying to get great week one performances. It's ultimately about postseason success, and that's where the pressure is currently at for the Miami Dolphins. And I do want to talk about what their upcoming season looks like and what challenges they're going to face. But before I do that, I do quickly want to hit on this idea of the fact that I don't want to graze by the fact that Patrick Surtain and Jalen Ramsey both became the highest paid defensive backs in NFL history within the same week. When we talked about this deal for Surtain on Tuesday, or I believe it was Tuesday, when we talked about it, part of the conversation was that in today's NFL, what are the positions, I should say, that get paid the most money? Obviously the quarterback's best friend in a blindside tackle. Wide receivers obviously have seen a huge boom in contracts this offseason. On the other side of the ball, it's defensive ends, the players that are supposed to get to the opposing team's quarterback, and now corners as well are sort of seeing their value take some ticks up. And that's something that we were talking about earlier in the week, is the fact that I don't know if the cornerback market has exactly been booming for all of this time, but now as we see wide receivers continue to make more and more money on the other side, you need players to lock them down. And I think that corners could see a significant increase in money in years to come. Now, part of it, and I don't know if this is a totally fair statement, but cornerbacks, it does feel like, because of how reliant more times than not, especially at that corner position in juxtaposition to the safety position, it's a lot of dependence on your athletic ability, because you're trying to mirror an ultra athlete that is lined up against you at receiver, but basically do it again in reverse, backpedaling and such throughout. So I think it's one of the positions, if not the position, that is most dependent on athletic ability. Running back, maybe you can make an argument as well, and typically we see running backs, and I think to some degree cornerbacks age not as well as some of these other positions. That is where my hesitation would come in general, with definitively saying the cornerback money is coming fast, that I think that teams are still going to be a little bit hesitant to hand out those contracts unless it's for some players young, such as a Pat Surtain. Maybe this Jalen Ramsey contract can be something that is used as a little bit of a measuring stick of how late can these cornerbacks execute at an extremely high level. But it's not like he's obviously the only one either that's seen it. I mean, you have some other players in their late 20s that are making big bucks as well, like a Marshawn Lattimore or a Marlon Humphrey. But generally speaking, I do think that these are positions where you look at all of the top corners in the NFL and how many of them are past their age 30 season. It's pretty far and few between. I guess you can look at the Eagles with Darius Slay and James Bradbury as those are sort of the veteran corners that are still prominent, but I don't know how many people are still slotting them into top 10 corners in the league and those types of conversations. So ultimately, I think it's a little bit more of a young man's position, but I am pretty fascinated as to what the overall philosophy with paying cornerbacks is going to be for years to come. Obviously, the Dolphins don't care. They feel like Jalen Ramsey has enough in the tank. That so be it. They're going to go pay him. But again, a contract that I think is going to be pretty crucial to the overall market of cornerbacks in years to come based off of how this deal ages for Jalen Ramsey and the Dolphins. But again, just sort of final thoughts here on the Dolphins themselves. They have a good amount of pressure surrounding them in terms of playoff success. Now, it's not make or break season in terms of jobs could be lost, really, if things don't work out for them. Mike McDaniel just signed a contract extension, so he's going to be in Miami for the next handful of years. Same with quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. So it's not like, again, this is if this year goes wrong, blow it up. But there's definitely been a little bit of buzz over the course of the offseason as a whole, I think, about this idea that McDaniel needs to win a playoff game. It's getting towards that point. He's also, helped transform this offense significantly in the past 2 years, and I'd argue that, I don't know if I would have picked them in either one of the games, whether it be in 2022 against the Bills or last year against the Chiefs. I probably would not have picked either of them, but injuries were also a pretty significant part of both of those games. Tua wasn't even available down the stretch of the 22 season. It was Skylar Thompson starting for them. And last year, there were a ton of injuries on the defensive side of the ball for the Dolphins that they were sort of having to scrap a little bit to put together even a roster to throw out there on the football field on the defensive side of the ball. So I think that, not that, again, injury excuses can only take you so far and can only sort of hold off the critics for so long. I don't know if people are even really giving McDaniel that benefit of the doubt, which, I personally am, but I'm not sure if that's a common sentiment among, the majority of NFL fans. But I'm not super optimistic about this upcoming season for the Dolphins. They definitely have a great chance to make the playoffs once again. But, talk about, we went through the numbers yesterday. It's usually around half of the playoff teams don't make it back to the playoffs the next year. And there are maybe some red flags with that Dolphins defense, not super substantial ones, but you talk about sort of the inconsistency with injuries on their defense, and that can only go so far. Again, we're talking about injuries here, but Ramsey's missed his handful of games. Bradley Chubb, excellent edge rusher, but injuries have been a part of his story, unfortunately, early on in the NFL. They lose somebody like Andrew Van Ginkel, who gave really good production from an edge rushing perspective last season. So there are a lot of potential concerns. I don't think it's anything too substantial. I think that Mike McDaniel is an excellent head coach, but really the thing that you have to look at is the difference of their record versus good quarterbacks to bad quarterbacks, because they have been able to sort of be merchants of some degree of beating up on bad teams and have really yet to go out and take advantage, or not take advantage, but, be able to fight above their weight class a little bit. And that's what I think that I'm really waiting for the Dolphins. But that being said, trying to lock down a player at a position that can potentially shut down opposing good quarterbacks, that's definitely a part of that conversation. So, sort of coming full circle here, they went out and they paid somebody because they are convinced that he can help shut down these opposing really good quarterbacks that have beat them in the past couple years. But we'll have to see. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Be sure to check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content. And we will be back on Monday afternoon to break down all of the weekend action in sports. Have a great weekend, and we will see you on Monday at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit.